What if this message did not appear on your screen to predict what is coming, but because something deep inside you already knows what is ending? Not in the sense of prophecy, not as a dramatic warning, and not as some strange promise that everything will change overnight, but in a quieter and more unsettling way. Maybe this message found you because a part of you has begun to recognize a truth your conscious mind has not been able to say yet. The old cycle is losing its power. You may still be going to work, answering emails, paying bills, making dinner, smiling when someone asks how you are, and moving through your days as if everything is still the same. From the outside, nothing may look unusual. Your routine may still be standing. Your responsibilities may still be there. The people around you may still assume you are fine. But beneath the surface, something has shifted. The life that once felt familiar now feels strangely distant. The patterns that once gave you a sense of control now feel heavier than they used to. The version of you who could keep enduring, keep explaining, keep waiting, keep proving, and keep pretending that nothing was changing has started to grow tired in a different way. This is not ordinary exhaustion. Ordinary exhaustion asks for rest. This kind of exhaustion asks for truth. In Jungian language, there are moments when the unconscious begins to move before the ego understands what is happening. The ego still wants a schedule, a reason, a clear sign, a clean answer. It wants to know when the new chapter will arrive, who will stay, what will be lost, and whether you are making a mistake. But the unconscious does not always speak in straight lines. It speaks through restlessness. It speaks through the strange heaviness you feel when you walk into a room you used to belong in. It speaks through the quiet tightening in your chest when you say yes to something your soul has already outgrown. It speaks through dreams, delays, repeated emotions, unexpected memories, and the feeling that you are standing at the edge of a door you cannot yet see. And spiritually, this is where divine timing often feels most confusing. God does not always announce an ending with thunder. Sometimes God lets the old thing become uncomfortable enough that you finally stop mistaking it for home. Sometimes the universe does not remove the cycle immediately. It first removes your ability to keep lying to yourself inside it. That is why this message may feel personal. Not because it knows every detail of your life, but because it touches the exact place where your old self is beginning to dissolve. Maybe you have been calling it anxiety, laziness, sensitivity, or confusion. Maybe you have told yourself you are just tired, just emotional, just going through a phase. But what if this is not confusion? What if this is recognition? What if the deeper part of you has already sensed that the old cycle is ending, and the discomfort you feel is not proof that something is wrong, but proof that something false can no longer hold you? Before a cycle ends on the outside, it often loses its life on the inside first. Before the door closes, the room grows airless. Before the next version of you appears, the old version stops feeling believable. And that is why the beginning of transformation rarely feels like confidence. It often feels like unease, silence, distance, and the strange realization that you can no longer continue betraying yourself in the ways that once helped you survive. The first sign that an old cycle is coming to an end is often not dramatic. It is not always a sudden goodbye, a closed door, or a moment that everyone around you can clearly see. More often, it begins with a quiet loss of life inside the very things that once made you feel safe. The job that once gave you structure now feels like a hallway you walk through with the lights dimmed. The relationship that once gave you comfort now requires you to shrink your honesty in order to keep the peace. The role that once made you feel needed now feels like a weight you carry because everyone has become used to you carrying it. Nothing may be visibly wrong. And that is what makes this stage so confusing. You can still perform. You can still answer messages. You can still make the drive to work, sit through meetings, buy groceries, return home after dark, and do what responsible people are expected to do. But inside, the meaning has begun to drain away. What once nourished you now only maintains you. What once felt like protection now feels like a room with too little air. And when this happens, many people blame themselves. They tell themselves they are ungrateful. They tell themselves they are restless for no reason. They tell themselves they should be happy because, compared with many others, their life looks stable. But Jung would ask a deeper question. He would not only ask what you have built. He would ask whether the structure you built still contains the truth of who you are becoming. There is a difference between a life that supports your soul and a life that merely keeps your persona functioning. The The persona can look successful. It can be polite, reliable, impressive, and admired. It can say the right thing at dinner, smile at the right time, meet deadlines, keep family members calm, and make other people feel that everything is under control. But the self is not satisfied by appearance. The self does not ask, do they approve of you? It asks, are you still present in your own life? And this is where the old cycle begins to reveal itself. You may notice that certain conversations leave you tired in a way sleep cannot repair. You may notice that saying yes feels heavier than before, even when the request seems small. You may notice that familiar places now make you feel distant from yourself, as if you are watching your own life through a window. This is not weakness. It is information. Your soul is beginning to separate what is alive from what is only habitual. Spiritually, this is often how God prepares a person to leave an old season, not by forcing them to hate it, but by allowing them to outgrow it. The old thing loses warmth. The old pattern loses innocence. The old excuse no longer sounds believable. And somewhere inside, quietly but firmly, you begin to understand that you cannot keep calling something peace simply because it is familiar. In Jungian language, this is the moment when the persona begins to lose its ability to carry the whole weight of your life. The persona is not false in a simple sense. It is the face you learned to wear so you could belong, function, protect yourself, and move through the world without being rejected at every doorway. You needed it. Everyone needs some form of it. But the danger begins when the mask stops being a tool and becomes a prison. You become the dependable one for so long that you forget what it feels like to need support. You become the calm one for so long that your own sadness has no place to sit. You become the reasonable one for so long that your anger has to disappear into silence. You become the strong one for so long that even rest feels like guilt. This is how a cycle grows roots inside a person. It does not always begin as a mistake. Sometimes it begins as adaptation. At one time, the role helped you survive. It helped you keep peace in your family, keep your job, keep people close, keep your world predictable. But what once protected you can later prevent you from becoming whole. That is why the ending of an old cycle can feel so confusing. It does not always feel like freedom at first. It can feel like losing the identity that made you feel safe. The ego will ask, who am I if I stop being the person everyone can rely on? Who am I if I stop apologizing for having needs? Who am I if I no longer organize my entire life around being understood, approved of, or chosen? These questions are not small. They touch the deepest structure of the self-image. And when that structure begins to crack, many people think they are falling apart. But from the perspective of depth psychology, something more meaningful may be happening. The self, the deeper center of the personality, is beginning to ask for a life that is no longer built only around survival, approval, and repetition. The self does not speak as loudly as the ego. It rarely arrives with a perfect plan. It often appears first as discomfort, as loss of energy, as the inability to keep pretending, as the strange feeling that your own life is asking you to be more honest than you have ever been. Spiritually, this is the place where God may seem silent, but the silence itself begins doing holy work. The old answers stop comforting you. The old distractions stop working. The old relationships and routines no longer cover the deeper hunger inside your soul. Not because everything around you is wrong, but because something within you is becoming more real. The old persona wants to maintain peace at any cost. The self wants peace that does not require self-betrayal. The persona asks, how do I appear? The self asks, what is true? The persona asks, how do I keep this from changing? The self asks, what is this change trying to reveal? And this is why your unease should not be dismissed too quickly. It may be the first honest sound your inner life has made after years of being asked to stay quiet. The old cycle begins to end when the voice beneath the mask becomes harder to ignore than the fear of disappointing people who only knew the mask. Emily Carter had always been the kind of woman people trusted before they knew the full story. At 38, she worked as an operations manager for a healthcare company just outside Portland, Oregon, where her days were measured in calendars, phone calls, staff shortages, patient concerns, and the quiet pressure of making sure everyone else had what they needed. She lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes from her office, close enough to stop by her mother's house after work and far enough from downtown that the evenings could still feel still when the rain moved across the windows. From the outside, Emily's life looked composed. She was punctual. She was kind. She remembered birthdays. She answered messages quickly. She knew which coworker needed reassurance, which family member needed help, which problem could be solved before it became visible to anyone else. People often told her she was strong, and for many years she accepted that word as if it were a blessing. But there comes a point when being called strong can begin to feel less like recognition and more like a sentence. No one meant harm by it. They simply knew the version of Emily who could carry things. They did not know the woman who sometimes sat in her car after work with both hands resting on the steering wheel, unable to start the engine because going home felt like continuing a life she no longer fully inhabited. One Thursday evening in early November, after a long day of solving problems that technically belonged to several different people, Emily walked through the employee parking lot beneath a sky the color of whetstone. The air smelled like rain and pine, and the office windows behind her glowed with that tired fluorescent light that makes even familiar places feel temporary. She got into her car, set her purse on the passenger seat, and closed the door. For the first time all day, no one needed an answer. No one was asking her to fix a schedule, smooth over tension, explain a delay, or stay calm for the comfort of the room. The silence should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt revealing. She sat there for nearly 20 minutes without turning the key. Then a question rose in her with such quiet force that she could not push it away. When did my life become something I only maintain, but no longer live inside? That question did not arrive like panic. It arrived like a mirror being placed in front of her. And once she saw it, she could not unsee it. She realized she had not built a life around desire, truth, or inner aliveness. She had built a life around not disappointing people. She had mistaken usefulness for belonging. She had mistaken being needed for being loved. She had mistaken emotional control for peace. In Jungian terms, the persona that had helped her survive had become the architecture of her entire identity. The helpful one, the steady one, the woman who never made things harder for anyone. But beneath that carefully managed surface, the self had been waiting, not to destroy her life, but to ask why she had disappeared from it. And perhaps this is how an old cycle begins to end. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with one honest question in a parked car, under a gray Oregon sky, when the soul finally speaks plainly enough that the ego can no longer pretend it did not hear. The next morning, Emily woke before her alarm, not because something outside had changed, but because something inside her had stopped cooperating with the old story. The apartment was still quiet. The street outside was still damp from the night rain. Her phone still showed the same unread messages, the same calendar reminders, the same responsibilities waiting for her. Nothing had collapsed. No one had disappeared. No door had visibly closed. And yet the world felt slightly altered, as if a thin layer of illusion had been removed while she slept. This is the part many people misunderstand about the end of an old cycle. They imagine it will announce itself through some obvious ending, a job ending, a relationship ending, a sudden move, a decision so clear that everyone can point to it and say, yes, that was the moment everything changed. But very often, the real ending happens before the visible one. It happens when the old pattern can no longer persuade you that self-abandonment is the price of safety. It happens when you hear the same request that would once have made you rush, apologize, explain, or overextend yourself, and something in you pauses. Not with bitterness, not with rebellion, not with the need to prove anything, just with a quiet inner refusal to betray yourself automatically. That is the twist. The old cycle does not end when life takes something from you. It ends when you stop giving your unconscious permission to repeat the same wound under a different name. For Emily, the cycle had never only been about work or family. It had been about the belief beneath everything, the belief that she had to be easy to love, easy to depend on, easy to approve of, and easy to understand. If someone needed her, she moved. If someone sounded disappointed, she softened. If someone misunderstood her, she explained until there was almost nothing left of her own truth. She had called this kindness. She had called it maturity. She had called it being a good daughter, a good employee, a good person. But beneath the surface, the unconscious had carried another meaning. It had learned long ago that being needed felt safer than being seen. This is how the shadow hides. It does not always appear as something dark or dramatic. Sometimes the shadow hides inside qualities other people praise. Helpfulness can hide fear. Patience can hide silence. Loyalty can hide the terror of being left. Responsibility can hide the refusal to admit that you are tired. Jung understood that what remains unconscious does not disappear. It becomes fate. It repeats through choices, reactions, attractions, obligations, and the strange feeling that you keep arriving at the same emotional place no matter how much the scenery changes. But once a pattern is truly seen, it begins to lose its sacred disguise. Emily did not suddenly become someone else that morning. She still made coffee. She still drove the same road past the grocery store and the elementary school. She still walked into the same office with her badge clipped to her coat. But when a coworker asked her to take over a problem that was not hers, the old Emily almost answered before thinking. The words were ready. Of course, I can handle it. Do not worry. But something stopped her. A small silence opened inside her like a door. And in that silence, she realized the cycle had never depended only on other people asking too much. It had depended on her saying yes before her own soul had been consulted. That was the moment the old structure cracked. Not because she lost anything, but because she no longer believed the role completely. And once you stop believing that you must disappear in order to be loved, the past can still knock, but it no longer owns the house. After Emily did not answer immediately, the room around her seemed to become louder, even though no one had raised their voice. Her coworker was still standing there with a folder in one hand and a tired expression on his face. The request was ordinary, almost harmless, the kind of thing Emily had accepted hundreds of times before. But this time, the pause changed everything. It gave her enough space to feel the old machinery inside her begin to turn. First came guilt. Then came the familiar fear that she was being difficult. Then came the sudden urge to soften her face, apologize for hesitating, and prove that she was still the same reliable woman everyone expected her to be. This is what the ego does when a new freedom begins to appear. It calls the unfamiliar dangerous. It tells you that a boundary is selfish. It tells you that silence is cold. It tells you that saying no will make people leave. It tells you that if you stop performing the old role, the people around you will stop loving you, respecting you, or needing you. And because the ego speaks in the language of survival, it can sound very convincing. The old cycle may have exhausted you, but at least it was familiar. The old pattern may have kept you small, but at least it gave you instructions. Smile here. Agree there. Explain yourself. Carry the tension. Keep the room calm. Do not disappoint anyone. Do not let anyone see that something in you has changed. In that moment, Emily felt the pull of the old self like a hand reaching from behind her. It would have been so easy to say yes. It would have restored the image instantly. Her coworker would have relaxed. The day would have continued smoothly. No one would have questioned her. But something deeper had begun to understand the cost of that smoothness. Peace that requires you to disappear is not peace. Stability that depends on your self-abandonment is not safety. Love that only recognizes your usefulness is not the same as being truly seen. Jung might say that the ego was trying to protect the old identity from dissolution, while the self was asking Emily to tolerate the discomfort of becoming more whole. This is one of the hardest thresholds in inner transformation. You may not be asked to make a dramatic change. You may simply be asked to remain present while the old fear screams for you to go back. Back to over-explaining. Back to chasing approval. Back to answering messages before you know what you feel. Back to choosing the cage because at least the cage has a name you understand. Spiritually, this is where divine timing can feel like emotional pressure. God may open a door, but your nervous system may still miss the old room. The universe may be guiding you toward a wider life, but your body may still trust the narrow one because it learned how to survive there. That does not mean you are failing. It means the old cycle is losing control slowly enough for you to see how it worked. Emily took one breath, then another, and instead of rescuing the moment, she let it be slightly uncomfortable. She looked at the folder and said, "I cannot take that on today, but I can help you find the right person to review it." Her voice was not harsh. It was not dramatic. It was steady enough to surprise her. The world did not end. The hallway did not collapse. Her coworker looked disappointed for a second, then nodded and walked away. And Emily stood there feeling something she had not felt in a long time. Not victory, not pride, but a quiet, unfamiliar spaciousness. The old cycle had whispered that freedom would cost her belonging. But in that small moment, she realized the first place she needed to belong again was inside herself. That evening, Emily did not drive home with the feeling that she had become fearless. She did not feel transformed in some bright, final way. In fact, as she pulled onto the road and watched the wet Oregon pavement shine under the streetlights, part of her still wondered whether she had been too firm, whether her coworker would think differently of her, whether the atmosphere at work would become strange the next morning. This is important because when an old cycle is ending, the goal is not to destroy your entire life in one emotional decision. The goal is to stop feeding the pattern that has been quietly consuming your life. Many people mistake awakening for sudden escape. They think they have to quit everything, cut everyone off, move across the country, or make one enormous gesture to prove that they are finally free. But real transformation is often much quieter than that. It begins when you stop giving the old reflex your automatic obedience. You do not have to burn the house down to open a window. You do not have to abandon every responsibility to stop abandoning yourself. Emily stopped at a small grocery store on the way home, bought a carton of soup, a loaf of sourdough bread, and a cheap black notebook from the school supply aisle. It was not a spiritual-looking object. There was nothing dramatic about it. But when she got home, changed into a sweatshirt, and sat at her kitchen table with the rain tapping softly against the glass, that notebook became the first place in a long time where she did not have to perform. On the first page, she wrote 3 questions. What drains me, even when it looks normal? What makes me feel honest, even when it scares me? What am I still holding only because I am afraid of what will happen if I let go? She did not answer perfectly. She did not need to. The purpose was not to create a plan overnight. The purpose was to begin listening without panic. In Jungian terms, this is how the unconscious becomes conscious. Not through force, but through attention. Not through punishment, but through honest observation. A pattern that remains unnamed continues to act like fate. A pattern that is seen begins to become a choice. Emily wrote slowly. She wrote about how quickly she said yes. She wrote about the heaviness in her body when someone expected her to manage their feelings. She wrote about the strange relief she felt whenever she had one quiet hour with no one needing her. She wrote about how peace had always seemed like something she had to earn by being useful. And then, beneath all of that, she wrote one sentence that surprised her. I want a life where I do not have to disappear to be loved. She sat with that sentence for a long time. Spiritually, this is often where God begins to rearrange a life from the inside before anything visible changes. Not by handing you a finished map, but by making one honest sentence feel more powerful than years of pretending. The universe does not always guide through dramatic signs. Sometimes it guides through the small moment when your hand pauses before sending the message you would have sent out of fear. Sometimes it guides through the breath you take before saying yes. Sometimes it guides through the quiet decision to sleep instead of overthinking, to wait instead of chasing, to tell the truth instead of decorating it so no one feels uncomfortable. Emily did not solve her life that night, but she did something more important. She interrupted the loop. She gave herself a few inches of inner space. And sometimes a few inches is enough for the self to begin speaking in a voice the old cycle cannot easily silence. Over the next several days, nothing in Emily's outer life changed enough for anyone to notice. She still woke before 7 in the morning. She still poured coffee into the same travel mug. She still drove the same 12 miles through the gray Oregon morning, past the pharmacy, the gas station, and the rows of fir trees darkened by rain. She still walked into the office with her badge on her coat and her hair slightly damp from the parking lot. But something had shifted in the way she carried herself through the familiar rooms. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was like the first pale line of dawn appearing behind a mountain before the sun has actually risen. The world still looked dim, but the darkness had begun to lose its authority. This is how a new cycle often begins. Not with a sudden reward, not with a perfect answer, not with every problem resolving at once, but with a subtle change in the way you inhabit your own life. You may still have the same responsibilities, the same bills, the same conversations, the same unresolved questions, but you are no longer meeting them from the same place inside yourself. You begin to notice your body before you override it. You begin to hear your own hesitation before you explain it away. You begin to understand that peace is not created by keeping everyone comfortable while you disappear. For Emily, the new cycle began with very small choices. She stopped answering work emails after 9 at night, unless there was a true emergency. She started leaving her phone on the kitchen counter while she ate dinner. She visited her mother on Saturday, but instead of staying for 5 hours out of guilt, she stayed for 2 hours with presence, warmth, and honesty. When her mother asked if everything was all right, Emily almost gave the old answer. Everything is fine. But then she paused and said, I am learning how to stop carrying more than I am meant to carry. Her mother did not fully understand, but Emily felt the sentence land inside her like a seed finding soil. Jung might describe this as the beginning of integration. The self does not always demand that you abandon your life. Sometimes it asks you to return to your life with your soul included. The point is not to become someone cold, unavailable, or detached from love. The point is to stop confusing love with self-erasure. A boundary is not a wall when it protects what is alive in you. Silence is not rejection when it gives your inner life room to breathe. Rest is not laziness when your whole being has been trying to tell you that the old rhythm was built on fear. Spiritually, this is where divine timing becomes gentler. You realize God was not only preparing something ahead of you. God was also preparing something within you, a steadier center, a clearer voice, a deeper trust. The universe was not asking you to force the new chapter open. It was teaching you how to stop dragging the old one forward. Emily's life did not become perfect. She still had difficult days. She still felt guilt sometimes. She still caught herself wanting to rescue moments that were not hers to rescue. But now there was a pause where the old reflex used to be. There was breath where panic used to rush in. There was a quiet inner light where the old fear once made every decision for her. And this is why the beginning of a new cycle can be so easy to miss. It does not always arrive like a door flying open. Sometimes it arrives as the first morning you do not betray yourself before breakfast. The first evening you let silence hold you without reaching for distraction. The first conversation where you remain kind without becoming smaller. Like dawn before sunrise, the change begins softly. But once the light has touched the edge of the sky, night can no longer pretend it is endless. By the second week, Emily began to understand that the end of an old cycle is not proven by how far you move from your former life, but by how differently you answer when the former life tries to pull you back. The same patterns still came looking for her. A message appeared late at night from someone who only reached out when they needed comfort. A family conversation drifted toward the familiar expectation that Emily would smooth everything over. At work, another urgent request arrived with the unspoken assumption that she would absorb the pressure quietly because she always had. Nothing about these moments was new. What was new was the space inside her before she responded. That space was small, but it was sacred. It was the place where the old Emily used to disappear. It was the place where fear used to make the decision before her truth could speak. It was the place where the unconscious pattern had lived for years, dressed as kindness, loyalty, patience, and responsibility. Now, when the old cycle knocked, she did not always open the door immediately. Sometimes she waited. Sometimes she took a breath. Sometimes she let the message sit until morning. Sometimes she said, I need to think about that. Sometimes she allowed another person to be disappointed without rushing to repair the feeling for them. And each time she did this, something in her became less afraid of being real. Jung would not call this a small thing. In the language of individuation, a person becomes whole not by rejecting every old part of themselves, but by bringing consciousness to the places where they once lived automatically. The goal is not to become hard. The goal is to become awake. The goal is not to stop caring. The goal is to stop using care as a way to earn permission to exist. The goal is not to abandon love. The goal is to learn the difference between love that honors the soul and attachment that keeps the soul repeating the same wound. Emily still had tenderness in her. She still cared deeply. She still helped when help was true. But she no longer confused every request with a calling, every need with her responsibility, every silence with rejection, or every disappointment with proof that she had failed. This was the quiet miracle. The world around her had not become easier, yet she had become less available to the old lie that peace required self-betrayal. One Sunday morning, Emily drove west toward the coast before sunrise. She had not planned it as a symbolic act. She simply woke early, made coffee, pulled on a sweater, and felt the need to see open water. The highway was nearly empty, and the sky slowly changed from deep blue to soft gray as she passed farms, pine trees, and small towns still sleeping. By the time she reached Cannon Beach, the wind was cold enough to redden her cheeks, and the ocean moved in long silver lines beneath the morning light. She stood near the water with her hands in her coat pockets and watched the waves come in and return, each one ending and beginning without needing to explain itself. For the first time in a long while, Emily did not ask life to give her a complete map. She did not ask God to prove that every choice would be safe. She did not ask the universe to show her every door before she took one honest step. She simply stood there and understood that the old cycle had ended in the most important place first. It had ended in her agreement with it. The guilt could still visit, but it could no longer rule. The fear could still speak, but it no longer sounded like truth. The old role could still appear, but she no longer believed it was the whole of who she was. That is how many endings truly happen. Not with a loud announcement, not with a perfect moment, and not with everyone understanding who you are becoming. A cycle ends when the same test returns, but the same unconscious reaction does not. It ends when the old loneliness comes near, and you do not run back to what drained you just to avoid feeling empty. It ends when approval is offered as a reward for betraying yourself, and you finally let the reward pass by. It ends when someone misunderstands you, and instead of shrinking your truth to become easier to accept, you remain quietly rooted in what you know. It ends when the old self knocks through guilt, fear, nostalgia, and habit, and the deeper self answers with stillness. This is not the end of difficulty. It is the end of being led by the part of you that was formed only to survive difficulty. And spiritually, that is why some messages reach you before you can fully explain why you needed them. Not to predict your future, but to confirm what your soul has already begun to know. God may not reveal the whole road at once, but he often gives enough light for the step that returns you to yourself. Divine timing does not always mean something outside arrives immediately. Sometimes it means the inner readiness arrives first. The promise begins as a shift in consciousness. The door opens first inside the person who is finally prepared to walk through it. As Emily watched the morning brighten over the Pacific, she realized that becoming new did not mean erasing her past. It meant no longer letting the past use her voice, choose her boundaries, shape her love, or name her worth. The old cycle had taught her how to survive, but it was not allowed to define the rest of her life. She turned from the water and walked back across the sand with no grand certainty, only a steady peace. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the clearest sign that a cycle has ended is not that everything around you has changed, but that something within you has become too honest, too awake, and too deeply loved by God to keep repeating what once made you disappear.